Yes. Then I think I will take the opportunity to wish you all heartily welcome to this short hour where you are going to meet the US Ambassador to Norway, Marc Nathanson, who will have a conversation together with Eirik Løkke from Civita. My name is still Kert Hansen-Bund. I'm the leader of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, and we are organizing this conversation and seminar together with Civita, the think tank. You are also, I think, invited to pose some questions after Eirik and Nathanson have had the conversation. So welcome, Ambassador. I hope we will enjoy the conversation now.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for your important work to promote the Atlantic relationship. It's always great to cooperate with the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, and today I have the great privilege to host Ambassador Marc Nathanson. He has been US Ambassador to Norway since June 2022, and I think it's fair to say that the last year has been quite interesting to be an ambassador in Norway and Europe. Putin's invasion of Ukraine certainly has tested the Western alliance and continue to test the relationship between the US and Europe. And make no mistake, the United States has been and still is essential for European security with its security guarantee. A vital question is, of course, how and if the United States will continue to play an essential part of European security. We will discuss these questions, and I'm sure we're also going to get into other questions the next 40 minutes. But before we start, let me quickly add, as Kate mentioned, we will open up for questions. So if you want to register on the speakers list, give me a sign and I'll register you. But remember that it's wise to be sooner rather than later, because we need to end 1:15. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. Ambassador Nathanson, again, welcome. There is an old Chinese saying, or curse, I would say, that may you live in interesting times, and you certainly is an ambassador in interesting times. How would you summarize the year you have been ambassador here in Oslo and Europe?
Well, it certainly has been full of activities, and activities that I did not expect. I first came to Norway as a graduate student in 1966, so there have been a lot of changes in Norway since that time, which of course I knew about, but I had no idea about what was happening in Ukraine, and that certainly has changed all the landscape in Europe, particularly in Norway and the United States. So it's been a year full of surprises. The good news is back in 1966 and today, I have found the Norwegian people to be very welcoming, very interesting, and it is still the most beautiful country in the world.
Well, I'm not sure that's true, but it's a very nice word, Ambassador. And how would you describe the relationship between Europe and the US at large?
Well, I think the relationship between Europe and the United States is even stronger. I think it reached a low point in the last administration, but it totally changed again, partly due to Ukraine. If Putin has done anything, he has unified Europe, the United States, Canada, etc. And we should add Japan, South Korea, and Australia, New Zealand, etc. And it has brought us all together to look and to fight what we think has been an unprovoked attack on a sovereign nation in the case of Ukraine.
And if we look to the future, I mean, the chief of military was here in Arendal for the Norwegian forces and said that time is on Putin's side. The longer the war lasts, the bigger his chances are, because there could be some fatigue in the West, fatigue in the US, fatigue in Europe. How do you assess the situation and the long term here?
I do think that is what Putin wants and expects. And he is not, unfortunately, concerned about the loss of life of his troops, much less the devastation to many of the villages and cities in Ukraine and the people. However, I do not believe the people of Norway, the people of Europe, the people of the United States, are going to turn their back on Ukraine in any way, even though we all hope there would be some type of settlement in the future, but it doesn't seem to be in the short term. However, we have to say that Europe and the United States in particular are unified. We, the United States, would not have brought the Gerald Ford, the largest aircraft carrier warship in the world, on its maiden voyage to Norway if we did not want to say to all of our friends and allies in Norway that you're very important to us, that Ukraine and our unity, look how Norway has stepped up. Who a year and a half, 2 years ago would believe that Norway would have sent arms to, even though they're defensive, to another nation?
How would you describe the reaction when the USS Gerald Ford arrived in Norway? There was quite a turmoil, and you had ordinary Norwegian citizens expressing their gratitude.
I was very pleased. I was frankly, between us, even though I know this is being televised, I was a little worried about 5,000 sailors after COVID, men and women, coming to port here. But I'm happy to say they've behaved very well, and there weren't any incidents that I was aware of anyways. But I think it was a great day. It was a great time for both Norwegian and American relations.
And what do you say to those critics? Not many, but a few say that this is a provocation for Russia, and to have this, to show this kind of force is an unnecessary provocation. What's your counter-argument to that?
Well, I see, whether good or bad, around the world, and we can look at Taiwan and China, many countries have sent in international waters or at the invitation of the host government ships, exercises. We've been doing exercises with Norway, for example, for so many years. Are those provocations? No, those are being prepared so we're never caught off guard again. We in the United States, Germany, Norway, after the Berlin Wall fell and there was a change in the Russian government, we all kind of de-emphasized our military, thinking the Cold War was over. That turned out not to be something that we should have done. And we're all, whether we're talking about the United States, Norway, Germany, England, are building up our military again, because we need a strong military in all these NATO nations as to really say to Russia and anyone else that we are unified and we're prepared.
There are critics, both in the US and Europe, who say, why do we send so much military equipment, money to Ukraine? We have problems at home, domestic issues. You have a fentanyl crisis in the US. There are welfare issues in Europe. What do you say to those critics who say that we should spend more money domestically rather than investing so much in Ukraine?
Well, we hear this all the time. And of course, we've heard this throughout the years. We heard this in World War II. Prior to the United States entering World War II, there were many critics in the United States saying we shouldn't get involved in a war in Europe with the Nazis. They invaded a neutral country in the case of Norway. That's a long way away. Maybe some people in Minnesota felt differently, but not all Americans felt that way. And yet, through the Crown Princess and other people at that time, the United States under Roosevelt entered that war because we have learned that even if it's in Europe or if it's in Asia or other places, as Madeleine Albright said in her book on fascism, we have to stop where that occurs if we want to protect freedom and democracy in our own countries, much less the country where the conflict is occurring.
And how important is it for the West to make sure that Russia doesn't win in Ukraine, however you define a win here? How important is it for our own interest to support Ukraine?
I think it is critical to all of our countries, all of the NATO countries, but more so the rest of the world. I think it's very important to other countries. They may not see it in India or in some African countries. I think it's absolutely critical to protect democracy, rule of law. There's so much to do in the world, and Norway has been a leader in humanitarian aid around the world. But how effective can that be if there's war and famine going on in the world? So we must stop Russia from this aggression.
A long-term question, of course, has been how much the burden sharing in NATO. And there has been, in my view, fair criticism from the US, and not only Republicans, but also Democrats saying that Europe should step up, invest more in the military. Are Europe paying more and enough, in your view, Ambassador?
Well, I am, as many of you know, a political appointee. Only 30% of our ambassadors, maybe less, today are political appointing. All the rest are career, who've worked their way up, which is similar to the Norwegian Foreign Service. I'm a political appointee, and in the past, a Democrat. Now I'm neutral, so I can't be a Democrat or a Republican. But the one thing I will say that I think Donald Trump was right about was criticizing, in some cases, countries that were not stepping up to their NATO commitment. And I think that has changed. I think that Germany, other countries, are going to, by 24, 25, meet their 2%. And I think it's very important, again, as a message to Putin or anyone else, that we will defend the sovereign right of nations that are not only a member of NATO, but cannot be invaded by another force.
And what do you think about the long-term commitment from the US in Europe? Do you think that Europe should step up and take more responsibility ourselves, and US step back and decrease its footprint? Or how do you see the situation going forward?
When I talk to Norwegian high school students, I say to them, the world is not just your country. It's a global marketplace. You, to prepare for the future, must understand the world, the globe. It affects Norway, it affects the United States, and I think we all have to step up. The United States has to, Norway has to, Germany has to, Portugal, many other countries have to be prepared, because we must stop totalitarianism, particularly when it invades another sovereign nation.
You mentioned Madeleine Albright, which has a really good and fascinating book on fascism, where she discussed the development and the rise of authoritarianism. How do you view this threat from authoritarianism? You see ideas both in the US and in Europe which are anti-democratic. It's worrying, isn't it?
It is very worrying and disturbing. The head of the US FBI testified, I think, about a year ago in Congress, and said the biggest threat in the United States is not outside terrorism. It is white supremacy in the United States, which is growing and becoming more popular and is very disturbing. In my personal opinion, not that as an ambassador, I think it was always there behind the surface in certain quarters in the United States, perhaps even smaller, but in certain quarters in Norway. But Trump brought it to the forefront. I think it would have stayed more or less hidden, but he kind of gave it a platform when he said there are good people on both sides.
Right, and obviously much of the Norwegian discussion about US is related to Trump. Unfortunately, that's also the case in the US. He's taking all the oxygen, and I almost hate to ask about it, but still, if you see the larger picture about how polarized the United States seems to be, what kind of implication? Because it does have implications about security and foreign policy, and especially in Europe, we're a bit nervous about what happens in the 2024 election and a United States at war with itself.
Well, I wish the United States was more like Norway, where you do have different political parties with different views on different issues, but on foreign policy in particular, it seems very unified and very supportive. That's how it used to be in the United States. I got involved in politics in 1968. I worked for a United States Senator as an aide, and let me impress you, my main job was carrying his briefcase when he went to different meetings. That's how high a level I was in the Senate office. But at those days, he was a Democrat from Wyoming, Gale McGee was his name. They were very friendly with the Republicans on both sides of the aisle. They were on the Foreign Affairs Committee. There was camaraderie, particularly on international issues. That has really disappeared. As far as I'm concerned, as I say, as a Democrat, as a private citizen, I had no problem supporting John McCain, George Romney. I thought these were good men. I was personally very friendly with John McCain. We differed on a few issues, I might say, but we were good social friends and had interesting civil discussions. That's not the case right now. I was actually at a dinner party at our home in Colorado, and we had two Republicans at a dinner table with 20, both friends of mine, and they were both Republicans, and one turned to the other. We had nothing to do with this conversation. And one said to the other, "I hear you're not for Trump." And the other gentleman, lifelong Republican, says, "No, I am for civility, and I cannot support Trump. I'm not going to support Biden, but I'm not voting for Trump." The Trump supporter, who was the other Republican, a banker by profession, then started to lay in and to attack him in a very uncivilized way, something that would be shocking if it happened in Norway, maybe not so shocking in Los Angeles, but certainly in Colorado it was quite shocking. And civility has really become an issue. I think the critical election will be the next election in the United States. And what happens in that election will tell a lot about the future. And I know all of our allies in Norway and other places are well aware of this and concerned about it. And by the way, it doesn't have to be a Democrat. It could be a moderate. But I'm absolutely shocked with the fourth indictment yesterday, the 95-page indictment, that more Republicans, distinguished, bright, intelligent Republican leaders, have not come out and criticized Trump. And people like Christie, who I think is a very bright, intelligent former governor of New Jersey, haven't gotten more traction, where Trump looks very strong in the Republican polls.
So the question is, how should Europe prepare for what's happening in the US? I mean, I'm interested to hear your thoughts, but I would say that the biggest threat for Europe isn't Russia, it isn't even China, but United States that is at war with itself. Should Europe think about a contingency plan, a plan B? I'm sure they do, but do you understand why we're nervous?
No, I can certainly understand that, but the good news is I went for Senate. When you're appointed an ambassador, it takes about a year to get through all the briefings, and you have to sell all your assets and so forth. So there's no conflict of interest. I know those things don't exist in Norway. No, I read the Norwegian papers. But whatever the case is, we have all kinds of rules on that. And then you go before the Senate. And you go before the United States Senate, both the Republicans on the Foreign Relations Committee and the Democrats. Let me say, when it came to the Arctic specifically, but also to Norway in general, and I'm not just talking about the senators from Minnesota, where my people are from, all the Republican senators, both senators from Minnesota are Democrats, all the Republican senators were very supportive and very pro, and I'm convinced no matter who is the president, if Donald Trump is elected the president, that the United States Senate and Congress will support the foreign policy that we're seeing right now in regard to Europe and Ukraine and NATO.
You mentioned earlier that Putin certainly betting on that Europe and the West will lose interest. If there should be a change of president with President Putin returning, President Putin, or sorry, President.
I think that was a Freudian slip.
You might be right. If Trump returns, how will this affect the Ukraine war, do you think?
I believe that American foreign policy toward Ukraine will not change. Aid packages may change. The amount of money may change. But I think we will continue to support. The United States so far has invested, not just militarily, but also humanitarian aid, $44 billion in Ukraine so far. I think that will continue. The big question, I think, for Europe and the United States and Norway is who is going to pay to rebuild Ukraine with all this devastation? Because those are many, many billions of dollars, and of course, such a great tragedy for anyone who is living in those villages.
To follow up on that, Ambassador, there are some critics, and you can hear that Norway are making so enormous amount of money on this war in terms of selling energy. Do you think Norway has a particular responsibility to commit money to rebuild Ukraine?
I think Norway has already stepped up. I was very impressed that the Norway leadership of all parties has stepped up with a 5-year commitment beyond the next election to make a commitment to Ukraine. I think other nations, including the United States, should do the same and follow Norway's leadership in that to show the world that this isn't related to one political party, but all the political parties support this.
I will soon open up for Q&As. I'm sure there are a lot of people who have interesting questions, comments that they want to make. But before I open up, I want to ask you, Ambassador, a bit more specifically about the US-Norwegian relationship. It seems that it's going very well, and I'm glad to hear, but are there any particular challenges, or how can Norway make sure that we build even stronger ties with the US?
I think the Norwegian-United States relationships are very strong, have been very strong, obviously since World War II. The Queen, as many of you know, last year was in Minneapolis and came back to there, and we had dinner, and she was concerned that the Minnesota National Guard, which has had a 50-year relationship, informal relationship with the Norwegian Home Guard, didn't have a formal relationship. And she wanted very much, as did the governor of Minnesota, have a formal relationship. I took that to the president and to the Pentagon, and we established that again to solidify, again, a very special relationship to Norway between the Minnesota National Guard and the Norwegian military. Again, another indication of that close relationship. I think that will continue. I think we are very much allies and friends together on most, if not all, of the world issues. Wales may be different, but on most of all the world issues.
How do you assess or think about the relationship between Norwegian citizens going to study or work in the US? Is it going in the right direction? Should we do even more to make sure that more Americans coming to Norway and more Norwegians go to the US?
Absolutely. COVID, which none of us had any control over, really dampened cultural and student exchanges and so forth. I think one of the great things, both for American students and Norwegian students, is to spend time in each other's countries. I think that's a big difference when you meet people, whether it's high school or college or work experience, have been overseas. So my embassy, under my leadership, will try to reinsert those exchanges as a priority for us, and hopefully the government of Norway will do the same. I think it's very important.
A question related to this, and it's a bit about communications and PR. I'm a bit curious, Ambassador, when you see many of the stories the Norwegian press print about the US, you got, of course, mass shootings, you got, of course, much about Trump and so on. How important or damaging is these stories for the relationships or for Norwegians going to the US, and how do you combat it, or how do you try to nuance it?
Well, one, the United States is not a perfect country. It's a very large country. It's a very diverse country. And we certainly have problems. Gun control has been a problem for a long time. And again, we could learn a lot from the Norwegians of how they deal with gun control, because there are many people who hunt in Norway for grouse, for other things, and they have mostly managed to control that. That's not the case in the United States, and we need to deal with that. But in general, it's a small problem. I was at a conference where American colleges were coming to Norway at kind of an open house, and one of the fathers of a Norwegian daughter who was thinking of sending his daughter to a college in the United States said, I'm afraid to do that because of the drive-by shootings and the problems. I said, what college are you thinking of? St. Olaf's. I said, I don't think you have to worry about drive-by shootings in St. Olaf, but what do I know about that? I think there are many places where it's very safe and so forth, but there certainly are problems in the United States, and the Biden administration and future administrations must address those problems. We still have a major issue with healthcare, with gun control, and obviously with choice that the Supreme Court has ruled on, and it's now going back to the 50 states, which makes it even more complicated.
But does that story you tell illustrate that the news coming in Norwegian press about the US is damaging or a problem?
I think it has to be explained and really looked at statistically. And I think that you can talk to the vast majority of Norwegian students who have come back from experience, both high school and college, as well as Fulbrights and others, and they have not had a problem and so forth. But we have to be concerned.
And you also spend a lot of time with Norwegian youth. How important is it for you to meet Norwegian youngsters and meet with them and discuss with them?
I think it's critical because I find that the Norwegian youth, unlike their parents and grandparents, have a much different understanding of World War II and what took place from 1940 to 45 in Norway. Interest levels are different, and I think it's important to talk about that. But more importantly, I think they have to look at the world. Norway, this may be a criticism, and I apologize to all the Norwegians here. I come from a very entrepreneurial state. In Norway, people don't like to stand out from the crowd. I urge high school students, by the way, at the urging of a Norwegian friend of mine to do this, to become an entrepreneur in their own mind, to promote themselves, to push themselves, to get as much education in whatever field they're interested in. And even though that might cause them to stand out in the crowd, they should still do it because the world is a very competitive place, and it's important to do that. Norway is a world-class community. World-class brains are here among high school students. I've been so impressed. I think they know more about American politics in public Norwegian high schools than in American public high schools. And I have 8 grandchildren, so I'm speaking from my own family experience. So I'm so impressed by Norwegian high school students and their understanding of American politics, but I think they need to push themselves.
I think it's a very good point, Ambassador. I haven't noticed anybody want to take the floor, and just remind you that the young gentleman there, you can have the floor with Camilla coming with. Remember to speak into the microphone and present yourself. Please stand up.
Hello, sir. Sorry, I fikk litt jernteppe. Thank you for the compliment about Norwegian youth. I was a part of the embassy's youth advisory board this previous period, and it's a pleasure to see you again. I came to remember a question we were given during my education at Oslo University College as an essay question concerning the US and the Ukraine. And I was wondering how you felt about the question we were given, or how you would respond to the question. So the question was, to what degree is US foreign policy decisions responsible for the invasion of Ukraine 2014-2022. And I was just wondering how you would respond to that, sir.
That's a good question. Ambassador.
It's a very good question because as far as I am concerned, just as a student of political science, Ukraine and what happened with Ukraine and the invasion, we have to go back to Crimea, obviously, but in more recent years, the United States, other neighboring countries, NATO, had very little to do with it. You can say that Putin wanted a puppet government, which was overthrown, as you know, in Ukraine by Zelensky and his government in what appeared to be a free and open election. The fact that that's what the people voted for, Putin thought, according to all the intelligence reports that have been made open source or public, he thought that the Russian speakers in Ukraine, which are a vast part of eastern and southern Ukraine, Odessa and so forth, would support the Russian troops coming in. That did not happen. Just the opposite happened. Even the Russian-speaking Russian population that lived in Ukraine for many generations were aghast by the invasion and became even more patriotic. So I don't think the United States, NATO, Europe had much to do with Putin other than his own desire to restore, under the Putin administration, the great Mother Russia, the Soviet Empire as he sees it. And to me, that is a huge mistake. But we don't have to just look at Ukraine. We can look at the stands, at Georgia and other countries and see mischief being done all the time, both cyber and otherwise, by the Putin government.
And just to follow up before we move on to the next question, could NATO and the US have done more to deter Putin, arming Ukraine earlier, making sure that the threshold for invading was higher for Putin?
Maybe, but hindsight is very hard to look back and say, should Ukraine have become a member of NATO, and then what would have happened? I don't think that would have happened. One of the problems in Ukraine, at least in my visits to Ukraine before I became an ambassador, I was vice chairman of an organization called the National Democratic Institute. One of the problems with Ukraine is a lot of corruption in the society at all different levels. By the way, that happened in a lot of former Soviet areas. And it's very important that the current government cleans up its act and becomes more transparent, again, like Norway.
Next question, please.
Torbjørn Bongo, Norwegian Officers and Specialist Union. The next debate in this room is what kind of relationship we should have to Russia. And to kickstart that debate, my question is, looking 10, 20 years ahead, what kind of relationship should we have to Russia? And let me add China. And the hard question, how to get there?
That's a long question.
A very important question, but I must say to you, it's not for me to decide. It's up to the Norwegian people and the Norwegian government to decide what relationship they want to have with any other country, including Russia and China. But I think there are changes. Russia is a neighbor. We've seen in search and rescue and fishing some very critical decisions. Now we're looking at the Arctic. As most of you know, we're putting an American presence up in Tromsø. We think the Arctic is going to be a critical area, not just for Norway and the other Arctic nations, but the United States, which is also an Arctic nation. But I think China has a lot of interest as unfortunately the ice is melting and looking at routes for goods to go to Europe. So we all have to be conscious of this. We all have to deal with this. But the Norwegian have to decide their relationships. The United States has to decide its relationships with Russia and China.
Well, I haven't noticed anymore. Sitting behind, and we have two questions. I think we're going to take those two questions and we're going to end, so we make sure that there are room for the next debate as well. Please.
So both US and Norway has constitutions that has been written quite a long time ago. And in Norway, of course, we revise this constitution all the time because we have to realize that Norway 2023 and Norway 1814 is slightly different. So how long do you think it will be before US maybe start to dare to alter a little bit in the American Constitution instead of just adding amendments?
Well, unfortunately, our Constitution, which was written in 1776, is also very outdated. As you know, women didn't have the right to vote in the original Constitution. Most of the signers were landowners and so forth. So there have been changes and amendments, but it's a very long and difficult process. And even though you didn't ask this, there needs to be changes. It's very hard to get 50 state legislatures in the United States to amend the Constitution. I mean, that's really the amendment process, and it is not easy to do. And I think in looking at the United States right now, particularly with the current Supreme Court, which is probably going to be the Supreme Court for the next 30 years or so, other countries are going to have to look at the United States, depending what business or policy you are interested in, from a multiple state point of view.
Just a short follow-up. In an ideal world, it probably should be room for another Constitution Assembly or something to see how you would modernize it.
It's a good idea. I don't think right now the atmosphere in Washington, we could get both parties there. Maybe after the next election, that I would hope, whoever becomes the president.
We have a last question from the audience, please.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yep. Whoa. Thank you for the great talk. My name is Carl Thodesen from Oslo Metropolitan University. I lived in the US for a long time, and when you live in a country, you view things differently. And you mentioned Norwegian youth are experts on the US. In your experience here, what do you think most Norwegians get wrong about the US?
Well, that's a good question. We could ask some Norwegian youth that are here. The media gives a lot of misimpressions. The United States, some people say, is a Kardashian culture today, which I don't personally think is necessarily a good thing. But I do think once youth spend time in the United States and meet other youth and talk to them, they find so many similarities versus differences. I was just fishing for Atlantic salmon with friends of my son who were from Bergen with their son and my grandson. And when you see the two youth talk to each other, exchange candy, go on the internet, only know what they're watching on TikTok or whatever, they seem very similar. So I think there is a general understanding, but there are misinterpretations by the world in general due to movies and other things about the United States. It used to be, particularly in poorer countries, the idea, if I could only get to the United States, there's gold in the streets, it's so easy. Well, look at the history of the Norwegian immigrants who came to Minnesota in 1880 when my people came to Minnesota, and the struggle that they had in making a living, particularly in the farming in the Midwest and other places. It's hard work, it's difficult. It can still be done. It can be done in Norway. It can be done in the United States. But it's not easy. It's not easy that you can come up with an idea and start Google and make $1 billion. That's not easy.
A final question from me, Ambassador. What do you see as the most important challenges in building the transatlantic relationship, US-Europe, going forward?
I think the most important factor and essence of a transatlantic relationship is more exchanges and more dialogue at all different levels, academically, but also with governments, also with students. The more we can talk and discuss issues, argue about issues where we have commonality, where we have disagreements, I think that will make a better and closer relationship. And I would encourage both Norway and the United States and other nations to do that.
Before we give a warm round of applause, just let me say, as mentioned, there will be a session here on Russia afterwards. If you're interested, please stay. If not, please leave, so we make room for others. Have a great stay here in Arendal. Ambassador, thank you for coming. I enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you all.